Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about blood biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease and where we're at and where we are headed. So sort of by way of background, I'm going to start really from the basics and then we'll move forward from there. So everyone here will be aware that dementia is a clinical syndrome. Neurodegenerative diseases, protein folding disorders within the brain that lead to progressive brain failure, brain atrophy and symptoms, and various diseases that affect the cerebrovascular disease. And what we know is that these two commonly overlap. And in fact, these two circles don't overlap nearly enough. They should be almost completely overlapping by the time you get to the elderly populations that most of us will be seeing. If we turn to the neurodegenerative diseases, these are defined pathologically. It's the pathological proteins that make the diagnosis, whether it's the Lewy bodies with alpha-synuclein of dementia with Lewy bodies and Parkinson's disease, which John will talk to us later on, the amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles of Alzheimer's disease that I'm going to concentrate on. But also there are clearly many other pathologies, various forms of tau, of TDP-43, that cause the other forms of dementia. But in common with all of these, and if we take Alzheimer's disease as the starting point, we think that there's protein misfolding and accumulation that starts many, many years before symptoms start. And for some people not everyone is going to accumulate those proteins. For some people who do accumulate those proteins, they're going to spread throughout various networks. They're going to lead to neuronal loss and neuroinflammation. Then they're going to lead to hypermetabolism, and then they're going to lead to clinical manifestations. And that process may take 20 years or so. And importantly, some people will have these proteins that are misfolded within the brain, but not ever develop symptoms in their lifetimes. So what's really quite extraordinary is that for each of these different proteins, seems to target different, although sometimes overlapping areas of the brain and lead to clinical manifestations. And it's those clinical manifestations that are still the bedrock of the diagnostic process, what we make the diagnosis today. And that's as it always has been. But the question really is, how accurate are those clinical symptoms for predicting the underlying pathology? So this is an important study that was published a few years ago in Alzheimer's centers across the US. So these were specialist Alzheimer's centers, and they took people who were diagnosed, and these were before molecular biomarkers that could tell us something about the brain pathology were available, and they compared the diagnosis that was made during life with what was seen at post-mortem. And you can see you can diagnose different people in different ways on the post-mortem basis, whether people are clinically probable or clinically possible in life, and then what grade of Alzheimer pathology they have at post-mortem. But you can see that if people were diagnosed with probable Alzheimer's disease, we had a sensitivity of 76 and a specificity of 60% for a correct diagnosis. And if you went to probable or possible, then your sensitivity goes up to about 87, but your specificity drops to around 44. So that means that if you diagnose somebody with Alzheimer's disease and you don't use some sort of test to try and confirm the brain pathologies, the proteins that cause Alzheimer's disease, whoever you are, however good you are, you're going to be wrong about 30% of the time. So think about that. In the UK at the moment, about 2/3 of people with dementia get a diagnosis of dementia, and a third get no diagnosis of dementia. And of the people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, we think people are going to be wrong about 30% of the time. Now, why does that matter? We'll come on to why that matters. But what we are increasingly trying to do is to start from the clinical manifestations. So the clinical features are still the bedrock of the diagnosis, but to move backwards up that pathway, so we can incorporate then the patterns of atrophy and hypermetabolism that we can see on structural and functional imaging, but move backwards to be able to identify those abnormal proteins. The idea being that hopefully this will provide increased specificity of the diagnosis, but also sensitivity. So we've heard about trials that are now going into the preclinical and the prodromal phases when people have got very mild or no symptoms at all. You can't do that if you just go on the clinical symptoms. So this opens the pathway for that. And this matters, as we said. First of all, we've got a very, very low diagnosis rate of all forms of dementia and a very, very low rate of confirmed diagnosis of specific forms of dementia. And all the charities, you go out to people. People are worried about dementia, the number one killer in this country. And getting a dementia diagnosis is important. Even if we made no further progress with the drugs that we have, people need to know what is wrong with them. If someone comes to see you, they're coming and asking what the prognosis is. For a starting point of medicine is an accurate diagnosis. It allows treatments that we already have. It allows access then also to clinical trials. And certainly when I speak to patients, speak to friends, think about myself, I think human beings are remarkably resilient and can deal with many things, but where human beings cannot deal with is uncertainty. And if someone comes to you worried about their memory, to be able to tell them with as much accuracy and evidence as we can what the cause of that, whether it's a form of dementia, and we'll hear from Beth as well, when it's not a form of dementia, is really important. And of course, we now have added spur to this because there are drugs out there that are available. They're licensed in the UK, they're not available on the NHS, doesn't look like they will be in their current forms now, or that may change in the future. And these two drugs, just to be clear about exactly what these two drugs are doing, we have lecanemab and we have donanemab. And basically we should be concentrating here on the similarities rather than any differences. There are differences in the duration of treatment, whether you have it every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, slightly difference in the rates of side effects. But basically what these drugs do, and you can see here on the top line here, this is the placebo here on lecanemab. This is the amount of amyloid you have in the brain. And this is patients treated. So that the amyloid load, one of the key proteins in Alzheimer's disease, absolutely plummets on lecanemab, and very similar in donanemab. This is placebo, and this is various doses of donanemab. So by the end of the 18 months of these trials, about 2/3 of people would not have been eligible to start the trial because you needed to have sufficient amyloid in the brain to start the treatments. So for that, it's going to be absolutely essential that we can confirm whether someone has the pathologies in the brain. And just a brief slide here just to show what the effects. There's no doubt these treatments have significant effects on cognitive function. You can see here in the slowing here in lecanemab versus placebo and donanemab versus placebo. The arguments come as to whether that change is clinically relevant and whether it's cost effectiveness. And those arguments are going on and will continue to go on, and we'll get more evidence in due course. So just to rehearse what we currently do in terms of investigations of dementia. Well, imaging, whether MRI or CT scan, was originally done to exclude other causes of dementia. Here's someone I saw with a progressive cognitive memory symptom who actually has an arteriovenous malformation here, which is slowly engorging and compressing the temporal lobe as a mimic of someone with Alzheimer's disease. We can look for co-pathologies here, the vascular pathologies that currently often accompany Alzheimer's disease or can be sufficient to cause cognitive impairment in their own right. And then we can use biomarkers to provide positive evidence for a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. MRI scan at the top, FDG PET below. These are markers of injury. These are injury biomarkers. They're showing that the brain is injured. Here at the top, which is ringed, is that the hippocampi have lost volume. And below, red colours being where there is glucose metabolism, the areas in the parietal and the frontal and the temporal lobes, which are hypometabolic. So these are showing not the pathology, or directly showing the pathologies, but they're showing the regions that are affected. But what we want to be doing is to moving towards that molecular biomarkers that's focus on actually being able to determine the different pathologies that cause Alzheimer's disease. And these are principally the amyloid plaques here, the tau tangles that we can see. And conventionally, what we've used for many years is PET scans, amyloid PET, and increasingly, or they're not, clinically used tau PET scans and measures of CSF, either looking at measures of amyloid or tau within the brain. So we've got 3 amyloid tracers, which are all licensed for use in this country. Again, they are not NICE approved. Certain centres use them, most centres don't. This is a negative scan. This is from some of our work on the left. You can see this bright uptake, which is in the white matter, which is non-specific. And here, when it extends out to the cortex, a positive scan. So these are licensed but not NICE approved. Does knowing whether you've got a positive amyloid PET scan make a difference? Well, this has been addressed in an extremely large study, well, several large studies, but one very large study, the IDEAS study, by a friend and colleague of mine, Gil Rabinovich, who works out of San Francisco. They went out to centres which didn't have these technologies, 595 centres in the US, with over 11,000 patients receiving Medicare. The median age was 75, and about 2/3 had mild cognitive impairment, so evidence of objective cognitive impairment, but not frank dementia. And the diagnosis was made, and then the PET scan was given, and the PET scans were positive in about 55% of patients with mild cognitive impairment. And we know that after about 5 years, 50% of people diagnosed with MCI will not have converted to dementia, and about 70% with dementia. Now, if you remember, I told you that the accuracy of a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease versus pathology was around 70%. So this is suggesting that this technology is being able to add to that diagnostic ability by providing evidence whether someone's got Alzheimer's pathology in the brain. And indeed, this resulted in a management change, some form of change, whether it's around medications and so forth, or counselling in 60%, and a frank diagnosis change in about 1/3. Again, that's compatible with the accuracy we know about a clinical diagnosis. And we found similar studies in a Europe study called AMIPAD. We now know that there are tracers that can detect tau within the brain. There's a first generation, which is licensed now in the US and in Europe, and second generation, which are more sensitive. This is again from our research work. So this is the different stages of Braak staging. You can see here, this is a Braak stage 0, has no tau in the brain. Braak stage 2, when it's linked to the temporal lobe. And this is when it's Braak stage 6, when it's extended outside of the temporal lobes into the neocortex. And the evidence for interest is that people who have no symptoms, who've got Braak stage tau more than about 3 or 4, are probably going to get some form of symptoms within the next 2 to 3 years. So this is probably the best marker that we've got at the moment of predicting who might get symptoms when people have pathologies within the brain. But so this is not something that is occurring on a clinical basis at the moment. And of course, for many years, we've had CSF biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. You can do many different CSF analytes. They will almost all of them will come to our central laboratory at UCLH, which is accredited to do these sorts of tests. In Alzheimer's disease, the A-beta 42 to 40 ratio, which corrects for inter-individual variants, goes down because we think the amyloid is trapped within the brain, and the phosphorylated tau 181 is increased. And again, this is now licensed and it is NICE approved. And as we've heard, there are quite a lot of centres that are now setting up CSF to be able to do CSF in memory services around the country, and we are supporting quite a few of those to do that. So where are we with these molecular biomarkers for Alzheimer's in the UK? Well, the latest memory service audit suggested that 2% of people in the UK are offered one or either of these tests. So that's an amyloid PET scan, which is not NICE approved, or a CSF. Why is that? Well, in part it's because it's not NICE approved, but secondly is that the UK is woefully short of technology, and that's both PET scans and its MRI scans. This is PET scanners per million people. The United States has about 5, we have 0.4, and it's not just the US being oversupplied, because we also fare very badly compared to other countries in Europe. So we just don't have the technology to do that, and that creates major hurdles when we want to think about giving disease-modifying therapies. CSF biomarkers, again, we are seeing an uptick on this. And if anyone is interested and wants to take a photo of the screenshot, this is a paper we wrote a few years ago about how to set up a CSF clinic. And this is actually what led Ross Dunn to set up his clinic. And we've helped and this is everything from what kits to set up, how, and now our consultant nurse does all of our lumbar punctures. We trained our nurse to do this. We had doctors on hand to help her. Now we don't need the doctors, because if she can't get them, we certainly can't either. So this is something that can be done, and there are nurse-led services in Gloucester and various other places as well. Fine, so you come to here to talk about blood, and I haven't mentioned blood yet, so what about blood? So even a few years ago, the idea that you could do a blood test for Alzheimer's was complete science fiction. I think we wrote a paper about this saying sort of much hope but little progress, but things have changed absolutely dramatically in the last few years, and it's because of technology. So there are lots and lots of fancy bits of kit now. The ones that you'll hear probably most around the Simoa technology here, or the Lumipulse here, but there are many others as well. And it's all about sensitivity. If you take a grain of salt and you throw it into an Olympic-sized swimming pool, these technologies can detect that there's salt in that water. That's how sensitive they are. So this is purely, there is a signal in the blood, are the machines sensitive enough to detect it? And they are now. And there are now lots and lots of different blood tests that are looking at different aspects of Alzheimer pathology. So you can measure a beta 42 and 40 ratio in blood, and that reflects mainly the amyloid plaques. There are some problems with this in terms of its accuracy and other things that can make interpretation difficult, perhaps some cardiac drugs as well. You can use glial fibrillary acidic protein, GFAP, which is some sort of measure of both tangles, but also around white matter. Neurofilament light is quite widely used as a blood biomarker now. Neurofilament light is a marker of badness within the central nervous system or peripheral nervous system. It goes up after stroke, it goes up in prion disease, it goes up in MS, it goes up in peripheral neuropathy. So if your neurofilament light level is elevated, there is a cause, but it's not necessarily specifically one thing. We also see a discrepancy between the blood and the spinal fluid levels, so it's not necessarily a very good screening marker. But the one that we are most interested in is phosphorylated tau 217. Which is a marker and reflects both amyloid plaques and tangles. So whilst it's got tau in the name, it's actually a reflection of tau in the presence or secondary to amyloid. So it's pretty specific for Alzheimer's disease. And so we'll see if this happens to be a very serendipitous protein because for many reasons. So first of all is that it does reflect both amyloid and tau. And that's actually very helpful in a clinical setting because it's sort of giving you a maximum bang for the buck, one test that tells you about the two core pathologies that you're interested in. It is really quite specific for Alzheimer's disease. It's not elevated in frontotemporal dementia. It's not elevated in the other tauopathies. It is elevated where there is more than one pathology. So I suspect we'll hear about this from John in the dementia with Lewy bodies, when there's often Alzheimer pathology as well. It will be positive because it's reflecting Alzheimer pathology. And this is a test for Alzheimer pathology and not Alzheimer's disease. This still needs to be done in the correct clinical context. There is emerging evidence quite recently that it can be very elevated in prion disease, probably just because you're getting huge neuronal destruction, and in some cases of motor neuron disease as well. These are not normally difficult diagnostic conundrums, and if you do a neurofilament light, those will be extremely elevated in those cases as well. It does reflect the extent of the tau pathology, so it tracks with the disease progression. And you can measure this on numerous bits of kit used from numerous commercial platforms, which is extremely helpful because it means there is very, very robust competition. And that means that it drives prices down. So there are multiple different phosphorylated tau assays that you can measure this blood in. Which one performs best? So we did a head-to-head trial. So what we did is we took blood and spinal fluid from 40 people that we'd seen, 15 who we were absolutely convinced did not have Alzheimer's disease, both clinically and on the spinal fluid, and 25 who we were absolutely certain did. We aliquoted these out and we sent them blinded to research companies and universities around the world. So you'll see many of the major companies here, from AbbVie and from Roche and from Lilly and Quanterix, but also to university centres. And we said, measure these blind and send us the results back. And this was really a fabulous leap of faith by these companies that they did this as a head-to-head comparison. There's one notable US company that was one of the first patentees who didn't do that. You can decide why they didn't choose to take part. And then they sent it back to us to analyze. So what we find here, so on this graph here, the further to the right is the bigger the fold change. So how much higher on average the results are in patients with Alzheimer's disease than controls. So the top right here, the University of Gothenburg and the Fujirebio Lumipulse are 6 times higher in patients compared to controls. So all of these are very significant, and all of the ones in green are phosphorylated tau 217 assays. The one in orange is 181, and then we've got 231. So what you can see here is this wasn't designed as a really head-to-head, but you can see that using multiple different platforms in blood, you can get a really substantial difference between patients and controls. So we published this a bit earlier this year if people are interested in Alzheimer's and dementia. The question then is, how do you interpret these blood tests? The take-home message here is that these measure Alzheimer pathology, and that no test is perfect, and this needs to be done in the right clinical context. So the way that most people are using these tests is to say, we're going to take someone with cognitive symptoms and objective cognitive decline. Don't do this in people who don't, for this stage, outside of a research trial. You measure your plasma phosphorylated tau, and you need to measure this on a robust platform in a clinical laboratory when you know that the test is reliable. We tend to use a 2 cut point model. So there's an upper cut point above which we set very, very high probability. So we want ideally to be able to tell people with at least 95% positive predictive value that if your test is positive, you've got Alzheimer pathology within the brain. There's a lower cut point, and if you don't have that, we're really sure that you don't have that pathology. And then we have a gray zone in the middle, which says we're just not certain. Now, this is in comparison to amyloid, PET, and CSF, and I'll remind you that we don't have this gray zone for those tests. We just say it's positive or negative, which is completely biologically implausible. We know that there's some measurement error. We know that people don't suddenly switch from being positive to negative. So actually what we're doing here is we're holding this to a much more robust standard. And we're saying there's going to be about 20, 30% of people when these tests are just not going to give us a terribly helpful result, in which case it goes to the clinical assessment, or you might choose to use other tests. So it's a clinical tool, it's an adjunct and not a diagnostic, and you need to be a bit careful. There are some things that are emerging as altering the plasma phosphorylated 217, which is obesity, which tends to send down a little bit because of probably a larger volume, and renal impairment as well. So some examples of just how the phosphorylated tau 217 performs in different settings. This is a busy slide I'll take you through. So at the top, we've got 3 different cohorts, research cohorts. One from Wisconsin, one from Canada, and one from America, I believe. So if you look at this top level here, you'll see, this is on PET scans, that these cohorts have got different proportions of people who are amyloid positive. So you've got healthy cohorts when it's 20%, through to clinically affected cohorts when it's 40 or 50%. And if you look at how the positivity of the plasma phosphorylated tau 217 works, you'll see it's very similar. So actually it does track across the different cohorts in proportion to their amyloid positivity, and that gives you a very, very high specificity level at the bottom. By contrast, if you look at the people who are negative, you can see, again, we've got a very high sensitivity for negative. So if we say someone is negative, they're very unlikely to have amyloid in the brain as measured on another measure. But there are these intermediate zones that range somewhere between 12 and 23, and these are in strict research settings. So there's now been some work doing this in clinical practice, work from Sweden. So these are people who've taken, some people who've had a standard clinical evaluation without any Alzheimer biomarkers whatsoever, in primary care and secondary care. People have said, what's your diagnosis? Then those individuals have had a blood test, and then they've gone on to have state-of-the-art clinical examinations, PET scans, amyloid PET, CSF, whatever is appropriate, and then they got a clinical consensus criteria to try and work out what the diagnosis is. And you can see that this is the dementia specialists. Before any tests, there's an accuracy of about 73%. You'll see a theme coming about here about how good we are at diagnosing these things without other tests. If you add in phospho-tau or combinations of other biomarkers, you get to above 90%. In primary care, the accuracy is about 60% and also goes up to above 90% in comparison with those gold standards. So you can see that there is this incremental value, as you'd expect, from another test, which is more widely available, which is providing information about the Alzheimer biomarkers. So we now have appropriate use criteria. The problem with these is things are changing so quickly, these become out of date. Most people feel that the potential uses, this is pre-screening for clinical trials. At the time this was written a couple of years ago, not yet standalone for clinical trial entry. There are now clinical trials that are just recruiting on phosphatase 217 levels. Whether that's right or not is unclear, but that's happening. Exploratory outcomes for clinical trials, are they getting target engagement outcomes? Only in symptomatic patients, and I think all of us, all experts believe at the moment we should not be trying to predict outside clinical trials which healthy elderly people have this are going to get dementia. Certainly from my own work, I can tell you that 20% of healthy 70-year-olds have a positive test, but very few of those have got dementia 7 or 8 years later. So we're not yet sure how predictive they're going to be. They've got amyloid pathology in the brain, but not necessarily dementia. Not let alone standalone, whether that's changing, and not yet in primary care. So, okay, this is all theoretical so far. Everything I've shown you is in research. So what have we done? So I work from the Queen Square Neuroimmunology Lab that Jay mentioned early on. We work very closely with them. We wanted to translate one of these tests into clinical practice. So we wanted to take one of the top performing tests. We wanted to take something that was commercially available and works on a commercial platform that most biochemistry lab has. So most biochemistry lab have a Lumipulse, and so we work with the Futura Bio team, and this is some of the work that we've done on our head-to-head study, showing these are positive versus negative people. This performs really very well. So I will tell you now something I did not realize until we embarked upon this is the standards that you need to do to get a research test into a clinical laboratory. This needs to go via the MHRA, which then defers this to the UK accreditation service. The lab's got to be done, and an absolutely extraordinary amount of work needs to be done around sensitivities and analytical detections, cross-reactivity, precision, accuracy, interference, stability, an enormous amount of work, which has been really led by my colleague Ashvini Keshavan, who works on with the clinical laboratory side of things. So we've done experiments like this with 2 different assays. What happens if you take the blood samples and you delay the time to centrifuging them? The answer is it's stable to at least 3 hours. What happens if it's done at room temperature, up to 2 to 8 degrees, is absolutely fine, or room temperature is fine. What happens if you centrifuge it? How long can you store it? And you can store it in a standard fridge for a week or 2. You can freeze store it on a number of times and it remains stable. And these things are really important if you want to go outside of specialist centres. What about renal impairment? So again, on the left, we've got patients with Alzheimer's. On the next bar, we've got people with non-Alzheimer's, and then we've collaborated with our colleagues at the Royal Free Hospital who see patients under the age of 50, because we wanted people who didn't have Alzheimer pathology, with various forms of kidney disease, from chronic kidney disease stage 1 all the way to stage 4. And you can see actually this assay doesn't seem to be terribly affected by renal function, which is positive. So now we've translated this into the Queen Square Neuroimmunology Lab. This is a real-life work we've done in patients who had CSF, who've had this in the lab. And you can see this is a graph. These are patients who don't have Alzheimer's disease, those who do have Alzheimer's disease. And we set a 97% specificity level for the top range and 95% below. We've now got ranges, so we actually provide you a number with an upper and a lower cut point. And in our first things, we got about 19% in this grey zone. So that's what we've seen here, and actually these are the actual positive predictive values and negative and the accuracy. We've now done this with a cohort from Imperial College who have amyloid PET. This was with CSF. This is a slightly different cohort, and which probably explains why we get a few more, about a third of people now in the grey zone here, smaller cohorts, and we're trying to work out how positive they are. But importantly, we have the same degree of accuracy. So whilst you have more people with uncertainty, still, if we say that you're positive, we're really very sure you're positive, and negative not. So now, this is, as of about 6 or 8 weeks ago, you can request this via the Queen Square Laboratory. It costs about £80. You'll get a result back within a couple of weeks. And it's now UCAS accredited. It's been inspected. And again, if anyone's interested, that QR code photo will take you to the lab and how you can request that. Now, of course, we've got a test now that is translated and works. We are continually auditing to see how it works in clinical practice. but it's not NICE approved. So if you're lucky enough that your laboratories will be happy to send that, then you can have it. We've had about 500 samples coming through now from Oxford, from Cambridge, from Imperial, from UCLH, from centres that you'd expect. And we're welcoming any other centres coming through, but what we really want to do is to provide the evidence for NICE that this is cost effective and useful. So we are now, with funding from lots of these different people in collaboration with our clinical trials unit, University of Kent, Imperial, LSE, we're running a clinical trial to determine how this works. This is the ADAT trial, which is Alzheimer's disease diagnosis and plasma p-tau217. So the idea of this is to run a randomized controlled trial in 20 plus memory centres across the UK. We want the target centres who do not have access to CSF or PET. We want to get where other biomarkers do not reach. And the idea of this is that people will enter and go through whatever is their normal pathway. They'll be seen at baseline, and then they'll be seen at 3 months. And 50% of those people, their clinicians will be given the phosphorylated tau217 result, and 50% won't. And the remainder will get it at 1 year. And that way we can see whether the diagnosis is influenced by the knowledge of that result, and we can do a cost-effective analysis as well. So we're running this with our registered clinical trials unit. We've done a lot of outreach to try and work out. What I've discovered doing this is the unbelievable variability of what happens in NHS services, from some people who are seen by a nurse and discharged immediately to some people who have massive batteries of tests. It's a huge variability. But what we want to do is, all we want people to do is to be seen at the start, seen at 3 months, and seen at a year for a routine set of questions. And then there's a few research phone calls in the meantime to collect additional data. We're also collecting a lot of qualitative outcomes. We're aware that the numbers only say one thing, so we're doing some semi-structured interviews with participants and with clinicians about what do they feel about the blood test, interpreting diagnostic confidence, the emotional impact of being a biomarker diagnosis, the impact on pathways, etc. And we really want this to be representative. So it was very interesting to hear about the populations that you serve. We're deliberately going to populations who see urban and rural. We want seaside. We want places that, again, the other tests don't reach. We want to map on to population prevalence and of different social grades. And we're going to be targeting those centres and then having real-time recruitment to try and change the outcomes. We're working with our colleagues at the London School of Economics to do a formal healthcare economics analysis, which is what's required by NICE to show that this is cost effective. And those of you interested, if you request one of these, it's about £80 to £100 if you do it now through the Queen Square Lab. Hopefully it'll be cheaper with competition. We've got a lot of PPI. We've got 2 public co-investigators who are guiding us. We've got informal networks. And we've done a lot of project-specific PPI with real themes around disclosure, and the indeterminate result, which is something that the patients are really grappling with as well. We also realise that there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and the clinicians want to understand how this works, including a lot about Alzheimer's per se. So Gemma Hazan, who's an old age psychiatrist who's working with the group, she's done a huge analysis of the perception of biomarkers for Alzheimer's, systematic review, which she's publishing. She went out and reached out to the UK old age psychiatrists. Thanks for many of you who might have contributed to this, with 240 respondents, most of whom were naive to using biomarkers. And we're looking at barriers about evidence-based, appropriate use, how to use clinically, some of the practicalities. But most people are very, very keen to use this and really quite optimistic. So Gemma, and this will hopefully be rolled out quite soon, she has done, and don't groan at another bit of mandatory training, but it's done very much on these mandatory training modules. It's about 20 minutes. This is data decision support tool. This is an online tool which will take you through everything, how to use the blood test, what it means, how to interpret it, some cases. And people entering the trial will have to take this. But actually, it's very engaging, and our clinicians at Queen Square all like doing this because you learn a lot about how to use the tests. So the clinical trial is now registered, and we should be opening our first centre in about 2 weeks' time. We've got a lot of centres interested, including hopefully in Southampton, and like to move down to Hampshire and maybe to the Isle of Wight as well. We've already had some other people in the room interested. So please reach out to me and we'll get you in touch with our clinical trials unit. As I said, the trial is designed to be as light touch as it possibly can. If you can do a clinical trial, you can do this. You basically need a fridge and being able to see people a few times. And just to say, there's unbelievable interest in this. We haven't even started this study yet, and you get the front page of the Times and the BBC. The public are absolutely, this is one of the things, I think, and I totally agree with Jay when it comes to the interest in the public at the moment. Prevention, diagnosis with blood tests and new treatments. People are upset but sanguine about the new treatments being some way off, but this is something that I think people understand, and it's very much on the government's agenda about moving better diagnosis closer to home. So this is the UCL team that delivers this with our old age psychiatry colleagues. We've got our colleagues at the clinical trials unit. We've got our PPI leads at Kent, the LSE, and Paresh Malhotra at Imperial. I'm very, very briefly just going to finish up with saying what's next. So this is going to happen. But as always, there are new developments. And the kit has got about 10 to 100 times more sensitive. So where the real excitement is now is around this bit of kit made by a company called Alamar. This is the new Lisasec. This is a new bit of kit that basically, through some extremely clever technology, which is getting rid of background noise and amplifying the signal using DNA technology, means that you can now get 120 or even 250 analytes from one sample. And so this is the CNS panel. This is only for research at the moment, but this will give you all of these. And in fact, this is out of date now because new ones have happened, and you'll see that these potentially give you all the amyloid measures, ApoE, base, lots of phospho-taus, TDP-43, alpha-synuclein, all in one sample. Now, I hesitate to say that some of these assays, some of the results are not as good as we'd hope at the moment, but they will improve over time. We've done a little bit of work just comparing Alzheimer's versus non-Alzheimer's. You can see that on this one sample, another validation for why we should be using phospho-tau is the higher it is the bigger the signal. More to the right is the more upregulated, more to the left is downregulated. 217 is the top hit, but you also get elevations in 231, GFAP in base, and amyloid is downregulated. And if you do this in CSF, you get all of the different phospho-taus, tau, lots of other things, and A-beta down as well. Now, this is also being applied to other diseases as well. And the other real exciting thing about this technology is if you've got a really sensitive instrument, you can either measure lots of analytes from one sample, or you can measure a few samples from a blood prick. So a finger prick. So work that's going on at the moment is whether you can send kits out, get people to do a finger prick test, go onto a special bit of kit that takes out the plasma, you send it through the post, and then you can analyze this for phosphorylated tau, neurofilament light, and a few different assays. Again, way off, but if we ever get to a stage of population-based blood screening for recruitment to preclinical trials, particularly if you combine this with cognitive testing that can be done remotely, this is the potential future for how we screen populations. Not for now, but that's where we're moving. So a few caveats and pleas. I'm a massive biomarker advocate, as is John, as is many of this in the rooms, but biomarkers are adjuncts to the clinical diagnosis. The more people know about the biomarkers, the more they're able to use them in a nuanced sort of way. The less people know, the more they will just rely on the biomarkers. I say, you've got someone with dementia with Lewy bodies, they're going to have a positive 217 test in at least 50% of cases. That doesn't mean that's the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. You've got to use these in a nuanced way. And remember that none of these are sensitive or specific. And those cut points that we've had for PET and for CSF haven't accompanied for any variability around that. Please don't request biomarkers unless someone's got objective cognitive impairment. We see this quite a lot now. And of course, there are some companies that I did an interview with a journalist who'd gone and had this done in their 20s. And they phoned me up to say, I'm getting the results tomorrow, what should I know? And I said, well, you should never have had the test in the first place. We don't know what this means yet in a preclinical cohort outside of a clinical trial. If you do it in someone who's got subjective cognitive impairment in their 70s, that Beth will talk about, there's a 20% chance it'll be positive.
doesn't necessarily mean that the cause of their cognitive impairment now is Alzheimer's disease, or they're going to get Alzheimer's disease, so we need to be really careful. And of course, it goes without saying, particularly leading on to the talks that will follow, that not all dementia is Alzheimer's. We happen to have a particularly good blood test for Alzheimer pathology, but we also now need better tests for TTP43, for tau, for synuclein, which are coming. So I'll stop there just to thank Ashvini Keshavan, who many of you all know, who really is the person who did her PhD with me and now is my clinical colleague running the ADAPT study, who's done all of this work. Henrik Zetterberg, who many of you all know, my colleagues at UCL, and Nick Ashton, who was in Gothenburg and is now in the States, and lots of different funders. So thank you very much for your attention.